If it's Tuesday, it must be Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and today we will be talking about British circularity. And I think we'll go beyond the borders of the UK to talk about the issue. And our guest is Dr. David Greenfield. David, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good morning, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be here.
And I see there's our first fun part is that this got unplugged. I tell you, it's never
technical solutions.
But at least I was able to catch it now, and then I was wondering why there was no sound. And I didn't have 57 minutes to actually come up with a snafu. So, David, again, let me go ahead and introduce you again. David Greenfield, thank you for joining. And we talked a little bit about, God in the world, more or less, prior to us actually going ahead and getting started with the show. And I mentioned that we hadn't been in touch for a couple of years, and we actually met at an event that took place here in Vienna. And Interestingly enough, I would have never found out about this event had David not gone ahead and sent out a mail. So that shows you how great communication could be here. And that was a great experience. Got a chance to meet David and a few other people. And we had at that time the Disruptive Innovation Festival going on, and you were actually running an event in London, and I was running an event here in Vienna, and we tried to do a simulcast that was actually a bit painful. If I remember correctly, but it has been a bit, and a number of things have happened since back in 2018. And so perhaps maybe from your perspective, and first it obviously give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, and then perhaps from your perspective, what has really transpired. And I'm keeping this only to the subject of circularity. You don't have to worry. You don't have to talk about anything else, and you do not have to talk about
quite easily, Mike.
the non-event that will be taking place in Brussels today. You don't have to talk about that one. So David, I give you the stage.
Good. Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, and good morning. Yeah, no, it's good to see you physically, albeit electronically. We haven't actually physically met since an EU conference, I think it was, on circularity. It was quite an odd conference, but and it was my first visit to Vienna, which I fell in love with. It's a beautiful city, and I think we had the meeting in February. And I found that using the electric scooter around the city of Vienna was a brilliant thing. But you should always wear gloves in February on an electric scooter because it was very cold.
I remember you were like a kid in the candy shop once you went ahead and found that e-scooter.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. Went and saw my favorite energy from waste plant that's designed to be artistic. But anyway, enough about 2 years ago. So I'm David Greenfield. I'm the European External Affairs representative for the Circular Economy Club. Circular Economy Club, if people aren't aware, is an international network of, we've got over 270 cities now that have their own chapter. It's a volunteer, not-for-profit entity, and our aim is to try and bring circular economy to the cities and regions of the world, and to get politicians and municipalities to embrace circular economy. My role is, I have a couple of roles. So as I said, I'm the European External Affairs. So, which means that I get the opportunity to speak to lots of people across Europe and outside of Europe about some of the work that's going on in the EU. But predominantly, I spend all of my working life mainly in the UK, and I run the Circular Economy Club in London, and I'm part of the team that runs the Circular Economy Club in Brighton, which is a small city on the south coast of England. We've got 23 clubs in the UK. So that's the Circular Economy Club, but I also have a day job. I run my own research and innovation practice, which is called SOENECS, Social, Environmental and Economic Solution. And we do a lot of work on the cutting edge of circular economy innovation. We're currently in the process of setting up a reverse logistics system for end-of-life tech. So household residents can bring their old tech, we'll data erase it, and then give it a second life. And my background's in public sector. I spent 15 years in leadership roles supporting the public sector to be efficient in waste and recycling. And I'm one of these sad people that has got a PhD in waste management. So if you're on Twitter or Instagram, I'm also Dr. Resources. Yeah, that's a little bit about me. I could probably spend the whole hour talking about some of the exciting stuff I've done in the sector over the last few years.
Well, I think it would be interesting, especially because there has been so much that has taken place over the last 2 years. If we use two years as a benchmark, maybe some of the highlights or maybe the low points, looking at it from a circularity perspective.
Well, I think I just really want to say, from a circularity point of view, one of the things that has been immense, and I'll stick to the 2 years, but if we look at the last decade, since when circular economy as a concept was championed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and started to get traction, it's still amazing to me that something that really emerged as an entity only a decade ago is now fundamentally embedded in European and national policy. It's embedded in multinational companies as a concept, and it's a term that people actually start to talk about. There was an article published by a colleague of mine, Dr. Fiona Charnley from Exeter University, that highlighted that over the last 5 years, the number of academic papers on circular economy has increased by somewhere in the region of about 500%. So as a topic, it's gathering momentum. Absolutely. We're seeing new strategies being developed all the time. But in the last 2 years, I think probably the most exciting thing, and this depends on your perspective of exciting.
That's coming from Dr. Waste.
Yeah, Dr. Resources. We can't use.
Sorry, all right.
We can't use the W word. No, the fact is that the EU adopted the circular economy strategy, and that is a bit of a game changer in the way that people need to think about this topic. In many cases, circularity is compared to sustainability. And the two are very similar. They have very many of the same components. There was a quote which I think Michael Braungart came up with. I might be doing him disservice, and it might be somebody else.
He's actually listening, so he will be able to go ahead and refute anything you say, David. No problem.
Yes, he probably will. And for the little quote suggested that sustainability is about doing or preventing bad to happen, whereas circularity is about ensuring that good happens. Now, it's slightly nuanced in terms of sustainability is dealing with what we've already got. Circularity is about preparing for what's going to happen in the future. And for me, that's a really critical thing. And this is why it's so exciting to see so many different types of people entering the circularity arena. I'm talking to architects, I'm talking to fashion designers, I'm talking to construction companies. 20 years ago, when I was a recycling officer in a city council, I was talking to people, and apologize if this is a bit of a stereotype, but in the 1990s, most people that were talking about recycling, you would assume were wearing green wellies and had long hair and were being very, let's say, hippie. That was the perception of being an environmentalist back in the 1990s. But now we're talking to corporates, we're talking to all sorts of different people that acknowledge that there's a global need to actually protect our environment and to do it in a new way. And the new way is multitudes of different opportunities, depending on what position you come from.
When I think about the UK, especially being the home for me of Extinction Rebellion, and a number of movements that have been seminal within the last 2 years, I tend to think that also has an effect on this general perception that we have towards the subject of circularity, and certainly the importance, and we can talk about Greta as well. But I think this, looking from an outsider perspective, I was always very impressed with the number of different chapters that you were able to create back 2 years ago in the UK, and now you're up to 23. And I always was wondering, why in the UK? Why is there such a success in the UK? And what would we need to do to replicate that? Because I do believe that we don't have that traction. That's my personal take.
It's a really interesting one, actually. And I think that one of the great things about the Circular Economy Club is that it's a network, and it's a network of people that are passionate about what they do. I got involved in the Circular Economy Club in 2016. I think it was. Yes, it was 2016. And I'd been working in circular economy by then for already nearly 6 years. And I actually was trying to set up my own international network of people. And I'd got some key individuals from the UK, and also people like Professor Walter Stahl interested in setting something up. And we got a little bit of traction, but to be brutally honest, the day job got in the way. And I was working with, there's an organisation in London called the London Waste and Recycling Board, which have been writing and doing a huge amount of work in London in particular to support circularity. And that ended up with the Mayor's strategy for the whole of London, including circular economy as one of the main components of the next 20 years. So I've been working with them for, again, nearly 10 years. And I was just at one of their meetings one day and saw a little poster for something called the Circular Economy Club. And it was on fashion. And I'm not fashionable. Let's just get that out there, albeit one of my fashion colleagues said fashion is all about your perception rather than somebody else's perception. But I don't follow fashion. So, but either way, I just thought that's really interesting. So I decided to go along and see what it was about. And I think that for me is one of the key aspects of why in the UK we're quite, there's a lot of chapters because we've got a lot of curiosity about the topic in many cases. But anyway, I went along to that meeting and met Anna Tari, who's the founder of the Circular Economy Club. It was actually their first ever meeting. And we got on really well. And I looked at what she'd set up, all of the website and all the work that had been done, and went, well, there's no point trying to create something when something's already there. Circular economy is all about sharing and resource efficiency. I'll just start working with Anna. So I did. And I then took that mentality to a lot of my colleagues, and I was telling them about the work we were doing in London. And so I've introduced, I think it's fair to say, Manchester, Bournemouth, the 3 counties, which is the newest one, Brighton, and I think one other. I've introduced people and suggested they go and set up their own clubs. But beyond that, there's a lot of really senior people in the UK that look at circularity from different lenses, from a biomimicry lens, from an industrial symbiosis lens, from a waste management lens, and then generally from a circular lens. So we've got a really active community, and we've got a good history in the UK of using networking to try and solve solutions. So I think it was at the right time that many people wanted a new body that they could work within. And I think there is probably a limit of how many chapters we can have in the UK. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think for me, one of the really key things about the Circular Economy Club is it's locally led. So it's about what the community in that area want, rather than a top-down diktat as to this is what you should be doing.
For those of you who just stumbled on the show, we are interviewing Mr. Greenfield, Dr. David Greenfield, sorry. And we are talking about the circular economy. One of the problems that we have quite often here is tied to competition. In other words, we're all working towards the same goal. And we think that we're in competition with each other. We are always looking for business. How does that play off in the UK? Do you have those same problems? Obviously, certainly you can't to the same degree as we do.
I would probably say we do have a very similar challenge. One of the ways of getting around that is trying to develop partnerships. And different chapters in the UK have done different ways depending on what's going on in their local area. So the London chapter, which we've got about 1,000 members on our mailing list. We've had anywhere from, I think the lowest we ended up was 3 attendees to over 350 on a single event. And for the last 2 years prior to COVID, we were running an event, a physical event, every single month, and doing with lots of different partners. I mentioned the London Waste Recycling Board. We do a lot of work with them. They've got the ability to assist the local authorities in London. And they've also developed the circular economy route map for London. But we then also worked with people like PwC and Ernst & Young and many other corporates that have actually hosted us. We've also worked with a lot of startups. So we worked with companies like BioBeam, which are taking coffee grounds and making fuel logs and other really exciting circular products out of it. We work with a Green Lab, which is what it says on the tin, a laboratory that focuses on green solutions. And we've worked with companies like Biome, which are looking at how you can use mushrooms as an alternative to plastic insulation. All of this network allows us to create a really positive series of events that spans a number of different topic areas. It's not about artists coming together to talk design. It's not about construction people coming together to talk about construction. It's about putting those two people in the same room and then looking at the similarities in how they actually undertake their activities. And I'm currently writing a book for the Institution of Civil Engineers on infrastructure in a circular economy. And for me, one of the key aspects is looking at the life cycle of the building. So what the book is being written in a way that we look at it from a life cycle perspective. So we look at the design stage, the material stage, the construction phase, the use phase. So what happens when the building's actually there, and then the end of use phase or the end of life phase, to look at what circularity interventions you can put in at each of those. Now, the reason why that's really interesting is because you can take that approach and move it from civil engineering to fashion or to electronics, because you've got the same life cycle aspects. You've got the design, the construction, the use, the materials, and the end of life. So that overarching parameters allows a huge amount of collaboration between different sectors because they're going through the same thing. So, and that's what we've tried to do in London and in Brighton, to get that cross section of expertise, which is really exciting when you get them. And that way it means that we don't get as much competition, and we try to do everything with partnerships with other groups, because otherwise you end up with 5 people going to 10 events and talking about something, and you lose the momentum. And that's the biggest challenge I feel. We need to try and knit together some of the existing networks, still give them their independence, but help them understand that collectively we've got a lot more opportunity to make change than if we go on our own little furrow. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to quite a short question.
Well, it actually is taking me down to a couple different facets. I'm going to give you a bit of profundity right here. If you get it, you get it. And if you don't, you don't. And one of the problems that we have in this middle of the take, make, dispose, when we talk, this is my personal take, that the major issue is this idea of growth in producing things that people don't need. Now, that means that we're talking about a mindset that individuals have, and one of the challenges, I mean, for you and me, it's easy because we understand that this issue of circularity is much bigger than you and me and all the rest of us. So we do not have these hangups, but we have a number of people who are still trapped in this growth mold that we have within the economy. And I believe that there's a correlation between this mindset that we have. Instead of open, we're talking about closed, and the ability to work together, as you described very well, in projects where it's all about inclusiveness. Only together can we make it happen. On our own, we can never produce as much as we can do together. And so I don't know what your take would be on this idea that the real problem is this model that we have tied to growth, and that people need to go ahead and free themselves.
I couldn't agree more. I think I'll give you a really small microcosm of that. I mentioned one of the projects we're working on. It's called Tech Take Back, where we're setting up, or we've set up an operation in Brighton Hove, which is the city that I live just outside of. And we've set up to capture end-of-life tech and end-of-life small electricals, with the purpose of data erasing the tech and giving it to local charities, so that people that are digitally divided or can't access computers can have their own kit. And equally, if people's got an old toaster, an old kettle, and if it's working, we can then redistribute it to people that might need it through a partner network called Freegal. Now that we've started that up, and we're just about to go live with a new app that will allow every single resident in Brighton Hove over the next 12 months to download this app and request a bespoke collection of this tech. So keeping the components in its highest possible state of quality by having a dedicated collection to preserve the tech as an item. We were testing the app, and my wife's got an iPhone 5C, which I handed down to her. So it's 6 or 7 years old, works perfectly fine. The battery's not too bad, does its job well. We were trying to download the test app onto the phone, and the phone didn't have the right operating system. And because it's a 5C, Apple have stopped updating the operating system on a 5C. If you've got a 5S, it's fine. If you've got a 5C, it's not. So, and this is one of the really big problems with not just tech, but the way that we approach our consumerism. And that's actually, in many cases, we are being influenced by something outside of our control. And that is the concept of built-in obsolescence. And that's where a huge number of major companies are still designing with a built-in obsolescence perspective within it, which is a real barrier to circularity, not just for the capture of materials and the resources that go into creating this stuff, but also to the fact that all of the marketing is, if you look at mobile phones as an example, all of the marketing is about sign up to a 2-year deal and you'll get a new phone every other year. That mentality is you need to have a new phone. You don't need to have a new phone. What you need is the ability to, depending on your circumstances, read emails, watch Tipping Point live on your radio.
You got the wrong order, but that's okay. We'll let that one slide.
Check all your social media stuff. But it's about the functionality. It's not about whether or not it's a shiny gadget. And I think that mentality challenge is starting to change as a result of COVID, actually, but not to the extent that I think many people that are in circularity would hope. I think there was a lot of optimism that the good thing that might come out of the COVID pandemic was that people might appreciate the resources and the materials they use on a daily basis a lot more. I don't know about in Austria, but in the UK there has been, let's say, a return to normality in that the beaches, when it was sunny during the summer, were absolutely full of people, and the amount of litter left on the beach was insane. There is a certain proportion of the population, and I think it's a large proportion of the population, that didn't understand or didn't take out of COVID the challenge that we're living in a resource-constrained world, and that actually we need to protect some of the resources. Even when people were going off and bulk buying toilet rolls and bottles of water and everything like that, the messages didn't come through that actually the resources that we use on a daily basis are constrained. Some people have got it, but not enough of the population. And I had this discussion with somebody a few weeks ago about single-use plastics. All of the good work that's happened on single-use plastics, which, let's be honest, is a relatively small problem globally, but is a huge visible problem. If you see a plastic bottle floating in the river, it's visible. And so there's a lot of, in the UK in particular, a lot of good work on single-use plastics, moving away from single-use plastics, the packaging of household goods at shopping centres, etc., reducing. As soon as we hit COVID, the amount of single-use plastic has just shot through the roof that's being used because of the need to be clean and health and safety, and particularly in the medical environment. And actually, there's a perception there that people are buying, for example, fruit wrapped in plastic now because they think it's cleaner than fresh. And it's not true. The coronavirus sits on plastic as well as it does on the fruit. So I think actually, unfortunately, COVID's also knocked back quite a lot of the good work that was done on trying to get people to think about the way they consume and moving away from consumption of single-use plastics, as an example. What does that mean for circularity moving forward? I think it means that we've got to try and re-engineer the conversation so people take some of that concept and bring it back into their daily lives. But I think we're going to have a really hard job unless we get some of the multinationals to do it on our behalf. There's only so much that 270 chapters around the world can do. A lot of what they can do is actually influence the politicians in their local area to adopt the concept. What we need to have is the likes of the multinationals taking this seriously and starting to adopt practice that means that the consumer doesn't need to make a choice because it's already embedded. And that, for me, is the aim that we need to get to.
It has to be a natural process, of course. I heard you talk about 3 different things, and I'm going to try to consolidate that of what you mentioned and see where that actually takes us. First, you mentioned the conundrum that we find ourselves in. You gave the example of these the telecom plans where you automatically get a new phone, and so you expect, well, if I don't get the phone in 2 years, then I'm being ripped off, so to speak. Whereas the actual ripping off, quote unquote, is this actual process where nature is the loser and we indeed are the losers as well because we are one with nature. That being the first part of the conversation. The second one was something that I on purpose didn't bring up because the people who listen to the show are so sick and tired of me talking about my disappointment of all the hope that we had when we went into lockdown and watching how everything went phooey. But there is a correlation between these two elements, the way that our system is put together and the certain behavior. And I wonder, especially when we're talking about the number of chapters that we have and all the activity that's taking place, for me, it's quite obvious that these people that we're referring to here are not part of the conversation. Yeah. So the real question for me is how we, you and I, and the others who are very much involved with the subject, that we are figuring out ways to bring them into the conversation, truly making it inclusive and allowing for them to be part of the solution. And I believe getting back to the point that you raised tied to the companies, if indeed we were all to get together in unison, then our argumentation would be that much better vis-a-vis the companies. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I'll give one of the examples of an approach that we've taken in the UK. So I mentioned I'm the co-organizer of the Brighton and Hove Circular Economy chapter, and that actually came out of myself and 3 colleagues starting an eco dinner club in 2015. Couple of my friends, colleagues were new to the area and just wanted to chat to people about environmental stuff. This was before I knew about the Circular Economy Club. So we ended up having a monthly eco dinner club where I had directors from the local authority coming along, local activists, independent consultants, a couple of members of the public. We even had a TV architect come along to one of them. And it was a really nice atmosphere to be able to discuss all sorts of things. There was no agenda. It was, here's some nice food, here's some nice drink, let's have a chat. That actually then started to grow into a much more immersive and less food-based activity, more into discussions and more into meetings. And as a result of that, over probably about 2 years, and with my knowledge of the public sector in the background, we started to engage a lot more with the civil servants in the local municipality who came along to some of our events as well. And in 2018, summer of 2018, they approached me and said, we're writing a new economic development strategy for the city. We've got a chapter on sustainable cities. We'd like to put something in there about circularity because you've told us all this good stuff about circularity. Can you help us? So as Circular Brighton and Hove, Circular Economy Club Brighton and Hove, they asked myself and one of the co-organisers at the time, Peter Desmond, who runs the Circular Economy Club Africa now, African Circular Economy Network, sorry, to just comment on the chapter, which Peter did. Me being an ex-civil servant, public officer, I edited the chapter and rewrote it from the perspective of how I thought the chapter should read and how we should incorporate circular economy. I, for example, and this is a very simple thing, which I was lucky enough to be able to do, but I think would probably not happen everywhere. They gave me the chapter. They put together a number of actions that they wanted to achieve from sustainability. And one of them was to make the city an electric vehicle city, which is brilliant. I made that number 2 and put number 1 to create a circular economy framework incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals for major topic areas across the wider city region to 2035. And that was in their economic strategy. That stayed in and that got adopted. So when that economic development strategy was actually launched publicly, they said, so this little thing about a circular economy route map, a circular economy framework, we've now got to do it. How are we going to do it? So for the last 18 months, I've been working with the team at the City Council to create a route map that, from an economic development perspective, incorporates circularity. And that, for me, is probably one of the simplest things that we need to do in circular economy, is find the way to embed it within the economic development side of city councils. Because as soon as you start talking to procurement people and finance people and development people about the opportunities of circularity, they get it. And you do that in tandem with sustainability officers. And you talk to the directors of environment, of finance, the chief executives, and they go, okay, right. So what you're saying is, if we start asking our, let's say, companies that we deal with to be more circular, we're going to get a lower carbon footprint. We're going to get better resource usage. We might even get a better price. Okay, why aren't we doing this already? And I think that's where a lot of people find the challenge of, how do we get this embedded in a local area? You have to find that in to the local authority, to the municipality, and to help them understand that this is an opportunity for them rather than a burden. And in many cases, sustainability has been seen as a burden in the past. And so circular economy, we should be painting as an opportunity for the future. And particularly where cities are developing rapidly. We know that by 2050, 70% of the world's population are going to be living in cities. We know that construction to accommodate all of those people is going to ramp up significantly over the next 15, 20 years. So now is the perfect opportunity to start embedding circularity into all of that new development. So how can we design new buildings to be disassembled at the end of the life? How can we design buildings made out of natural materials? How can we design buildings that are low carbon? How can we design them so that they're using renewable energy, green roofs, etc., etc., etc.? And actually the public sector can actually do that by the way they specify, but also approve planning. So it's finding the right element of local government to be able to influence, which is, for me, probably the easier aspect, having worked in local government. But I would say to any chapter or anybody that's trying to influence on circular economy, the first port of call is to really bring on board the public sector in your local area and help them understand this is let's say a recovery plan from COVID, but it's an opportunity.
Yeah, it reminds me of the three elements that I think that we always need to focus on. And I think you summarized them very good, David. That being awareness, that they actually understand what's going on. Secondly, how do we get past this? And what's in it for me? And you always need to include these three elements. If you don't, then you're missing opportunities, or perhaps you get frustrated because people aren't doing necessarily what you're looking for. And so that's very, very important. For those of you who have just joined, you are in the radio and Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and I am interviewing Dr. David Greenfield. The doctor's in the house, and we are talking about circularity. For those of you who are watching on LinkedIn Live, YouTube, et cetera, please feel free to go ahead and ask us questions via the chat box. Now, you mentioned earlier, David, that you are the representative of Europe within the Circular Economy Club, if I got that right, which is obviously very interesting today, taking on that role, but I know that you're up for the challenge. And we talked about how you've been able to go ahead and create a success in the UK. And I'm wondering, looking at it, and you might dispute this, that the UK has a special status in being able to look at the continent from a different perspective. I think that's probably the most diplomatic way for me to go ahead and put that. But you will see the differences, and you will not have necessarily the biases that we might have here on the continent. And so I would be curious to get your take as far as circularity, not necessarily using the word maturity, but something in that direction of maybe labeling who's getting it right, who needs some work. And I don't expect you to name names, but I'd be keen on getting some general impressions of, because we are not a monolith, and we know that here, and we need to make progress. And I think that certain countries are truly making a lot of progress.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's a really interesting one, and I'm just having a look at the comments. I love the fact I've just been described as a boy. Great.
We're going to go out with a boy band here, Dave.
The Circularity Boys. No, absolutely. Let's make music to make circular trendy. I think one of the really interesting things about the UK, and there's a number of different factors, and the UK, as you rightly say, and England in particular, because we have got the 4 countries of the United Kingdom. One of the main advantages we've had for embedding circularity in the UK is that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation was started in the UK, and Ellen is a brilliant ambassador for the concept of circular economy, and she's been able to get into senior governments and major corporations, and as a champion of circular economy, that's meant that a lot of people listen. A lot of people go, if Ellen's saying something, then we need to look at it. Now, that's not to say that she's single-handedly done it on her own, but what she has been able to do is to shine a light on this as a topic area that we need to embrace. And I think it comes off the back of 20 years of trying to promote sustainability and good ways of working from a waste recycling and reuse perspective. So there's an organization called WRAP, the Waste and Resources Action Program, that's been around now for 20 years. And that was for the first 10 years of its life, supporting local government to move to higher recycling rates, but also to improve reuse and to minimize waste. That legacy is also, when paired with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and now combined with individual chapters in local areas, means that there's a momentum of the circular economy is not new to people now. Not all people. It's there. We've got it in our resources and waste strategy, a national resources and waste strategy, which says the UK wants to move towards a circular economy. So we've got national legislation and national strategies that are saying circular economy is important. Now, that top-down approach doesn't deliver, but it gives the parameters to allow delivery to happen. And I think the other thing that's really exciting in the UK is that there is actually a lot of opportunity for startups to embrace and start some really interesting circular businesses. I've had the honor and pleasure of working with a few really creative startups over the last few years that understand circularity, but are seeing the solutions that they're creating absolutely as part of the circular economy, but doing it for the purpose of trying to preserve resources, create something natural. I'll give a couple of examples. So I mentioned a company called Biome. I'm lucky enough to be one of their non-exec directors, so I might be slightly tainted in how I approach this, but I'll try to be as neutral as possible. One of the biggest plastic elements of a building is the insulation. It does a very good job, but it's also very polluting at the end of its life. So Biome came up with the concept of, actually, can we grow our own house insulation using mushrooms, mycelium, the roots of mushrooms. So over the last 5 years, I've been developing this insulation board that is naturally grown, is a carbon sink, has exceptionally good thermal properties. And that's being embraced by many, many different large organizations. Now, alongside that, the 2019 Dyson International Award winner is a young lady called Lucy Hughes, who created a new plastic replacement out of fish scales and algae. And she's made a plastic film that, again, is trying to be used as an alternative. The exciting thing in the UK is that there's a lot of, let's say, not even venture capitalists, but there's a lot of acceleration funds that are helping organizations like that take their concept and bring it to the market. Biome's just creating a new manufacturing hub at the moment. Lucy's in the process of testing her materials to bring it to market. That support network is so important, because otherwise what we'd end up with is many, many really, really exciting opportunities, but no ability to actually deliver that. And I think for me, that's where there's government funding as well. So we've got something called Innovate UK. And there's a lot of money that can be let's put into research to bring things to market, and then you bring some of the European funding into that as well. For me, that is an absolutely essential component of being able to make circularity deliver on the ground. You can have all the policy you want, but if you haven't got the right economic environment to allow creation, design, startups to actually come together and fulfill their potential, then there's no point having the policy. So it has to be mirrored. It has to be the right policy approach and the right economic conditions, and to get some of the teaching right. A lot of these organizations, and Lucy Hughes is an example, she was on a degree at University of Sussex, being taught by a colleague of mine, Claire Potter, who's a circular designer. And Claire teaches circularity in her design course. And Lucy and a lot of her colleagues, a lot of her peers, just embraced circularity as a solution, and then wanted to try and create solutions. And Lucy came up with the solution, and I had the pleasure of judging the end of year show for the design course, and I had to check with my friend Claire that she hadn't invited me to the wrong show, because the levels of innovation from undergraduates, I was saying, you sure this is not a PhD show? It was amazing. And I gave Lucy the Circularity Award. But it has to be systemic change. It can't just be one individual parameter. So it needs to be academia, it needs to be public sector, it needs to be financing, and it needs to be social challenge as well. So individuals within the community that bring it together. And I think the UK is very good at bringing all of those together, not intentionally, but it's organically grown into that with some really good prompters.
And how would you compare that to the experience that you've had with those countries on the continent?
It's a very difficult one to try and compare, because in many cases, different European countries have got different, I'm not going to say national mentalities, but they've got a different approach to how they undertake their daily life. And some of the countries are far more systematic. You have to be able to do this before you do that, before you do the other. I think the UK has always been, you mentioned right at the top of the show that we've got a unique perspective on how we view the continent. I think that comes down to the UK's embracing much, in essence, possibly of disruption. We quite like to disrupt things, but also we don't like to go beyond the rules very often. But let's be honest, some of the European solutions that are coming out are absolutely brilliant. Holland, the Netherlands, in terms of the epicenter of circular economy, absolutely, I think, is far beyond any other country in the world, with the possible exception of some parts of China, which might surprise people, me saying that. But the Chinese have been embracing this for a very long time. They're creating cities that are solely powered on solar power. But in terms of Europe, Amsterdam, for example, their circular economy strategy that they've just launched this year, which is based on the donut economy, is a leap forward in the way that the public sector approaches circular economy. So I think Holland and a lot of, they've got the Circle Pavilion, which has been funded by a bank. That sort of embedding within the normal communities is so important. France has been doing some really exciting stuff, possibly not from a circularity perspective, but actually what they're doing is circular. And that's a really important point. There's a lot of people doing really good stuff that can be defined as circular without understanding that it might be circular. And I'll get a very quick example was we said right before the show that we could quite easily go on for over an hour, and I've just realized we haven't got
5 minutes and 23 seconds.
I took a delegation from the City of London to Paris 3 years ago to look at some of the innovations that Paris are doing. Paris have done some really, really good and innovative actions, but not under the banner of circularity. They've done it under the banner of sustainability. And things like the Wattway, which is the solar road. The concept that 90% of the time the road is open to the elements, why don't you capture the sun's rays, is such a simple solution. They've championed that. They've got trials going on. We went to see the planning team, and all of the new builds in Paris now have to incorporate an element of green development, which is absolutely exciting. They've also got a really interesting fund that 10% of their annual budget they put into essentially a call for the local population to be able to choose how that money's spent, and a large proportion that gets spent on environmental activities. You've then got things like in Vienna, actually, the fact that any new builds, correct me if I'm wrong, but any new builds in the centre now have to have a green roof as a minimum planning standard. There's some really progressive and some really exciting things being done in cities across Europe that might not get some of the same press that we do from the UK, but in many ways more advanced and more important than some of the small exciting startups that are coming out of the UK. So for me, I look in awe at many of our European colleagues at what they've achieved and want to learn from them. I think the other thing is that I also look in awe and learn from the chapters across the world that we have, because Europe's brilliant, but actually the rest of the world is doing some really exciting stuff as well. And I had a really lovely, I suppose, well, it was definitely pre-COVID, but 18 months ago we held a chapter meeting in London, but we also had via live stream from Medellin and from Bogota, the representatives from there. And we had I was chairing a virtual and physical conference between three people. And we had the same challenge. In Colombia, the challenge is now that the middle class want to have packaged food in single-use plastics because they believe that means it will last longer and it's cleaner. Exactly the same problem, slightly different solutions. And they started going bio straight away. So I get very frustrated with my colleagues who go, "Oh yeah, Europe's doing brilliantly. Europe's doing brilliantly, but the rest of the world is also doing brilliantly, and there's a lot to learn from them."
Oh, I think there's plenty to learn if we take this whole idea of reverse engineering and you understanding the power of frugal innovation, dealing with constraints, and understanding the development that takes place. We can really learn a lot. What we need to do is get past our biases and thinking that what we do is so great and what the others do is so inferior. And if we're able to get past these problems, then I think the world would be a much nicer place. And so we're getting to the close of this program. Well, maybe we'll continue a little bit longer on the live feed. So maybe some closing words from your side, David, as far as next steps from your side. I know I'm not giving you too much time to cover this up.
No, I think, but very, very briefly, from a Circular Economy Club perspective, we've got the global, or so the World Cities Week that's coming up at the end of October. So 26th of October through to the 2nd of November to coincide with the UN World Environment Day. Now, depending on where you are in the world, you may already have a chapter in your city or your area. What I would do is reach out to see if they're doing anything for that week. If there isn't a chapter,
reach out to him. Reach out to this guy here. There we go.
If there isn't something going on in your area, or indeed even there isn't a club in your area, Circular Economy Club is about people actually setting up their own chapters. So Mike's running Vienna. Get in touch with Mike, see what Vienna's up to. If there isn't a club in your area, apply to set up your own chapter and then run an event. It's about local solutions. For me, I think really the key thing is let's see how we can make everything as circular as possible.